ready to go.
Good afternoon and welcome to the regular meeting of the Board of Estimate and Apportionment and the presentation of the fiscal year 2025 annual operating plan. Today's meeting is on Wednesday, April 17th, 2024. Ms. Shannon Davis, please call the roll.
Mayor Jones.
Present.
Comptroller Green.
Here.
President Green.
Present.
All are present.
Okay, items presented for the first time. Item number 1, request from the Comptroller's Office for approval of contracts and leases for various city departments as listed on Exhibit A. Item number 2, request from the Comptroller's Office for approval of intradepartmental and interdepartmental transfers from various city departments as listed on Exhibit B. Item number 3, request from the Comptroller's Office for approval of transfers between projects for capital improvement funds as listed on Exhibit C. And item number 4, request from the Affordable Housing Commission Executive Director to transfer $2.5 million in state and local fiscal recovery funds to the Community Development Administration under Ordinance 71592. This transfer reflects operational alignment and efficiencies between the Affordable Housing Commission and CDA, or the Community Development Administration. And after we approve the agenda, we will go to the budget hearing or budget meeting. So I will entertain a motion to approve the agenda as written.
So moved. Second.
It's been moved and properly seconded. All those in favor, please vote by voice vote of aye. Ms. Shannon Davis, please call the roll.
Mayor Jones.
Aye.
Comptroller Green.
Aye.
President Green.
Aye.
All in favor?
Okay, great. And now we will turn it over to Paul Payne to present the fiscal year 2025 annual operating plan. Paul, floor is yours.
Thank you, Mayor, Madam President, and Madam Comptroller. I am going to share my screen and pull up a budget presentation. Hopefully that works. Is it on screen now? No, not yet.
No.
Try it again.
There it is.
There it is. Very good. Okay. The proposed 2025 annual operating plan totals $1.33 billion. That's an increase of 0.4% over the previous fiscal year. And I've got in that box below the general fund, the major fund categories. The general fund at 580.9 as proposed is a 2.5% increase. You're going to see as we go further that most of that increase is due to this year's revenues. Next year's revenues are projected to decline, so that increase is going to be muted by that. In the special revenue categories, it's $255.2 million. That's a 9.2% increase. And again, as we talk a little bit further into revenues, you're going to see that particularly the use tax is up by about $17.9 million. That revenue reflects one-time revenue for this year, as well as the increased level of revenues going to the use tax fund in the coming fiscal year. With also some smaller declines in special funds, particularly the public safety sales tax of a decline of about $1.5 million. In the grant fund categories, that's $61.9 million. That's a 23% decline. Last year's budget had an emergency shelter grant from the Department of Human Services of about $12.5 million. That was a non-recurring appropriation. So that's why you see that the majority of that decline there. In the debt service fund, $15.1 million. That's a 7.9% increase. That includes the 2023 debt service on the 2023 GO bond issue. And it will anticipate the $6 million, another iteration of the neighborhood stabilization bonds that were issued earlier this year. The increase in the capital improvement funds, that total budget of $81.1 million, is a 92% increase. That incorporates last year's one half of the prior year operating surplus of $35.9 million. Last year, when we had a surplus and half of those funds, when it was about $24 million, we had a supplemental capital appropriation in the month of January. This year, rather than have a separate appropriation, we rolled that into this the annual budget ordinance. So when individuals ask what happens to surplus funds at the end of the year, it is used for a good purpose. And we'll be getting into that a little bit in terms of capital appropriations, as well as adding to our fund reserves. And the enterprise funds at $308.1 million, that's an increase of 7.7%. That incorporates both water division and airport budgets. And the internal service funds, I usually, these are somewhat of an accounting function here, simply because when the new accounting system came online, the employee benefits fund, there is a piece of that which is more of a liability on the balance sheet rather than an expenditure. And with the new accounting system, we were able to divide those two so that only the internal service fund of the health benefits fund is included here rather than the entire amount. That's why you see that decline. It's more of a technical change than anything else there. But you can see from the chart below a $1.3 billion budget, the general fund at 44% remains the largest of those fund categories. Now, in going to look at revenues, if you remember at this time last year, budget estimates, the economic outlook was that we would show little to no growth or potential recession, and we budgeted accordingly. Fortunately, we haven't seen that, so revenues through the third quarter are exceeding projections. Although we have seen some slowdowns, and you're going to see some of those particular taxes which have seen some moderation over the last 12 months. Now, the first one being the earnings tax, which is our largest source of revenues to the general fund. It's actually still growing at 5.9%. The withholding portion of that tax is up by 5.7% through the fiscal third quarter, and the corporate receipts are up 7.5%. We typically see most of the corporate receipts in the fourth quarter, so that's still pending in terms of the results of there. But the 10-year growth rate for the earnings tax has been about 3.8%, so it's one of our strongest growers in terms of revenue to the general fund. Now, we have seen, you'll see a market decline in the payroll tax, at least in terms of the growth rate. It's up 1.6%. So it's got its, while it's both on payroll, similar to the earnings tax, the universe of payees to the payroll tax exclude government and nonprofit agencies. So the payroll tax is strictly for-profit enterprises such as businesses and such. And that growth rate has slowed this year, and it's up 1.6%. Now, when it comes to the sales tax, we have seen a market decline in terms of growth rate. Last year, the sales tax had increased 7.5%. That's an unusual growth rate, which is boosted in somewhat by inflation. This year, we've seen less than 1%. It's through the third quarter, it was up 0.6%. Its 10-year growth rate is just under 2.5%. Now, the local use tax is another story. We've seen that through the third quarter increase by 27.7%. Most of that we presume is related to the third-party payees on online shopping and such. That expansion went into effect last January of 2023. But it's been over a year now since that has occurred. So we do anticipate that to be plateauing at a certain point. I would say also that when it comes to sales tax versus use tax, the sales tax, if you add in all the various rates, adds up to almost $220 million. So it's a three and a half times larger than the use tax. So the local use tax isn't large enough to make up for a decline or a small growth in the sales tax. But it is revenue that we will be appropriating in the use tax funds that you'll see as we get to that exhibit. And then two other revenues I always like to point out, and just to give an indication of how the city's economy is doing. And restaurant gross receipts, they are up about 4.6%. It's not as much as last year, but it's still a good growth rate. Meanwhile, hotel tax receipts are up about 2.4%. That's a little that's been a pullback. I do not expect, based on what projections are for hotel room nights sales this year, are expected to be somewhat down. So we're not expecting much growth in the hotel gross receipts tax in the coming fiscal year. Overall, this is an exhibit basically outlining both the general fund revenue outlook as well as some of our major special funds. You can see that the third quarter revenue estimate in the third to the last column The FY24 revised estimate showing that we're tracking about $18 million over on the general fund side, and there's that $11.5 million in the local use tax side. So those two are over. Should point out, however, that in FY25, we've got a built-in decline here, and we're going to talk about that in a second, and no growth in the local use tax. So in planning for the general fund budget, and I walked you through these in the past. Basically, you take what we've got estimated in the current fiscal year, $566.9 million. And as I just described, through the third quarter, we're beating that estimate about $18 million. Now, also contained within the FY24 revenues is that there was a one-time adjustment for some TIF agreements, which reduced our revenue this year, but that was one time. So we should get that back in FY25. So that's an increase of 6.2. Also, not contained in this year's estimate was a marijuana sales tax. Now, I've got that estimated at $2.4 million. So far, year to date, we've gotten two monthly receipts of that of about $80,000+ each month. I'm told by the Department of Revenue, it takes a few months for that to mature until we get a normal recurring rate to rely on. This estimate relies on to have it being at least $200,000 a month. You don't know exactly for sure until we start seeing what that full month would be, but we'll be able to follow that as the months pass during fiscal 25. And then the base revenue growth estimates, we do expect some growth underlying all these adjustments, about 2.1% overall. That would be $12.7 million. Now, the big question, obviously, is what happens with our earnings payroll tax and given the current litigation and such. Well, what this estimate assumes is that basically, since we don't know what the result would be and we don't have any hard numbers, it basically takes a reasonable estimate of a 15% reduction in the non-resident portion of the earnings and payroll taxes, which would end up being about a $26 million reduction in overall revenues. Again, I liken this to the pandemic when we actually had the economy shut down and we really didn't know where this was going. So you hope to craft what is a reasonable estimate and reasonably conservative estimate, and then you've got contingencies should it go worse, and obviously you hope for it not to be as bad. But this is a contingency. It's not a known number, but it is for planning purposes, best and prudent to put an adjustment in the revenue estimate for FY25 so that we're prepared just in case. So with all of those adjustments, that leaves us with a base revenue estimate of $580.9 million. So if you take the current year's budget, which is $566.8, what are the increases and decreases we will be seeing in the proposed budget across the departments in the general fund? And I won't hit every one of these, but you can see by various sections of government. General government Board of Aldermen was reduced 3 positions, and they had some one-time costs related to their communications project that they did this year, which is non-recurring. The personnel office had some personnel cost increases, and they've got 1 added position. The biggest item here being ITSA, that's our Information Technology Services Agency. They continue to see higher costs related to the management of the accounting and payroll accounting systems that were implemented over the last year, or actually over the last 2 years, and that managerial expense is continuing in the FY25. So that general government up $1.8 million. In finance, the comptroller's office added 8.5 positions this year, and there's an additional 4.8 million or 4.8 positions for this coming year, mostly in the accounting and auditing functions. There's also a $200,000 increase in their 911 telecom costs. So overall, that's a $1.9 million increase. Citywide accounts are some adjustments here in asset preservation costs of the convention center and the scheduled Scottrade enterprise center debt increase. But the big change here is that we've made our final dome preservation payment. That was the $1 million per year. That's the last piece of from the financing agreement that built the dome. That was made in this current fiscal year. So that $1 million goes away in FY 25. Parks, Recreation, and Forestry, they had a number of adjustments. In forestry, there's been a sort of a trade-off between what they do in what's called per performance or part-time employees managing their weed and debris control versus contracted out services. They've been having difficulty in hiring their part-time people, so there's an increase in their contractual line. That's overall a net increase of 0.4 million. They've also, both forestry and parks, in the area of their construction equipment operators and heavy equipment operators, those kind of categories have seen some pay increases in the current fiscal year, which are budgeted for. So Parks and Recreation itself is up $2.4 million. In the judicial offices, the offices of the circuit court themselves, they had a contract, a grant expired for their electronic monitoring program, and so that's going to be an increase in their general fund budget, as well as some of their case management services. And they've also—
Paul, we lost your audio, or at least I'm not able to hear you anymore.
I didn't lose his audio.
Okay, let me try to figure out what's happening. My internet, now I'm getting an internet unstable. All right, go ahead.
Okay. In the circuit court, we'll also see facility maintenance contractual costs of about $800,000. Bigger change in the court offices is in probation and juvenile detention. They've been receiving increased referrals of juveniles, mostly in sort of a continuation of the raise the age legislation that occurred a couple of years ago, which raised the age of juvenile detentions to those 17 or less. So their proposed budget includes 14 additional positions, as well as some contractual increases to address those increased costs. In the offices of the circuit attorney, the general fund budget is at 3.5 positions, and they've also have other funds increases, and that incorporates some increased salaries as well as their filling of the positions that were vacant previously, and that's a $1.4 million increase. The sheriff has got a slight increase, although they did request a number of increases in positions that are not in this proposed budget. The county offices, the biggest increase there is in the election board. The election board has alternating years with election schedule coming up this coming fiscal year in FY 25. There are 4 scheduled elections, and so that's an increase of about $900,000. Medical examiner increase is related to their services, mostly for autopsies and such, and that's about $400,000 increase there. In the street department, a couple of increases and decreases there. First, in the streets, because of the mild winter, for the first time in a long time, they did not request an increase in or an amount of $500,000 to replenish their salt supply, because they didn't use as much this current fiscal year, and so they should be pretty well stocked going into FY 25. In the refuse division, the big item there is a transfer station, which is the cost of disposing of waste. If you remember from last year, there was an estimated number there. The cost per ton continues to increase, but the tonnage estimate has been low. The actual tonnage usage has been lower this year. So the decline there has related to the actual tonnage disposed and not the actual increase in the disposal rate. But similar to parks, streets, and refuse, their heavy equipment operators and CEO and construction equipment operators saw salary increases as well, and that's incorporated within those budgets. Overall, streets is up about $2.9 million. Public safety, police, and police pension. While you see a decline here in the general fund side, police overall is going to be about the same as last year, because we're going to get to the use tax side in a minute, and you're going to see increases on that side. But they do have some attrition in their salaries, and they've got increases in some of their contractual services lines, which are offsetting some of those decreases. They also have an increase in overtime, which offsets some of the decline, which is offset by some of the decline in the salary accounts. So the general fund side is down 1.2 million, but you're going to see the increases in the other funds. In the fire department, including fire pension, it's about a $3 million increase in what's called the GEMT salary offset. What's that related to is it's a special fund the state program reimburses the city for its runs for EMS, and simply because the fire department has utilizing more of the contractual services for doing some of our EMS runs because of staffing of the department. That has meant that we have less revenue coming into that special fund, which offsets salaries in the general fund. So the salaries in the general fund will go up by that amount, and then you'll see a like reduction in the GMT special fund. And so the fire department is up about $4.5 million in the general fund side. Other public safety, there's a lot of activity here. The biggest ones being Office of Violence Prevention had a $2.6 million budget this year. You're going to see that entire function has been moved to the use tax fund. That was a $2.6 million, in addition to some of the contractual services that were funded previously under ARPA. So you're going to see a budget for them of about $7.5 million in the use tax fund. The building division includes a permitting system, which costs of $1.3 million in total, which is prorated between the general fund and the building division, building demo and lead funds. In the general fund, it's about $1 million cost there. Big change in the City Justice Center. They have been carrying over 120 positions vacant for a couple of years now. This reduces those totals by 65 for the CO1 as a correctional officer. Total reduction in the Justice Center is about 70 positions. They have over 120 vacancies. But what they've been seeing is that they carry these vacancies and they had excess funds in their salary. So this basically brings them down to more what they've actually been spending over the last few years. And so they should be okay with that reduction. The Civilian Oversight Board, that's just salary savings. They've had some vacancies there. That's a couple $100,000. So that reduction there in those other public safety departments is about $5.5 million. Human Services, not much in there. That's primarily funded through grant funds. Board of Public Service, you're going to see some increases in contractual services on facilities management, as well as utility increases, which brings in the reduced salary charges to other funds for BPS. That's about a $1.7 million increase. So overall, the increases net in the general fund of about $14.1 million, which added to the budget this year, it brings you to the $580.9 million, meeting the reduced budget estimate for this current fiscal year. And the next slide, an illustration of the revenue changes for the general fund. You can see both historically for the last couple of fiscal years, as well as the revised estimate for FY24 and the estimated 25. You can see because of the contingency reduction in both the earnings and payroll tax, you can see net change aside from underlying growth and the TIF adjustment. Earnings tax at $210.6 million. That's down 5.2% from revised estimates. Property tax is $81.4 million, at 1.7% increase over an elevated level current fiscal year. Sales tax is $62.4 million. That's a 2.8% increase, but the underlying growth rate we're assuming for the sales tax is only 1%. That 2.8% is higher because of those TIF adjustments I mentioned earlier. So the sales tax growth, we do have a very modest rate incorporated in the FY25 budget. I broke out separately the marijuana sales tax, but I didn't want that to skew our sales tax estimate, but that is $2.4 million in total. Payroll tax, again, because of the TIF adjustment that skews that a little bit, it would be a greater negative, but it's down 8.1% from the revised estimates. And then franchise utility taxes, that's up a bit. Now, utilities usually go up a bit, and so we capture that. But in addition to that, we've got the water division and airport, which are higher, and they are also contributing to those results at $57.5 million, which is a 4.4% increase. Intergovernmental receipts at $1.9 million, or 1.9% increase, $21 million total. We've seen some declines in the license fees, particularly the cigarette fees, which have been down this fiscal year, and then $59.7 million in departmental fees. Those are all the non-tax fees, building permits and such that are a large part of our other non-tax revenue in the general fund. The other category, $32.2 million, which would be our transfers. That's almost flat, a 1.1% increase. So you can see all totaled is $580.9 million, which is a 0.8% decline from the revised estimate of 585.5%. In the pie chart below, you can see how that's distributed across the various revenues, the earnings tax at 36.3% of that total. I won't go through these all in detail in the next page, since I've already walked through most of them. But you can see in the general government that reflects its increase. The Comptroller's Office up 13.3% in the Department of Finance. We do have that $1 million going away in for the Dome asset preservation payment. That's why you see the non-departmental down 1.8%. Parks, Recreation, and Forestry reflecting those increases that we talked about in parks and forestry divisions. Judicial offices also up 8.6%. The county offices up 13%. It's mostly the Board of Elections. Now, public safety, again, while it's down 0.8% in the general fund, that's offset by increases primarily in the use tax fund, which is where particularly the Office of Violence Prevention was moved over, as well as some of the salaries of the police department. Health and Human Services, small increase of $200,000, and the Board of Public Service at 4% increase of $43.2 million. But overall, the budget to budget is up 2.5%. Public safety is still remaining about half of the budget. Okay, and the local use tax fund, as I mentioned, there's a lot of activity going on there. The FY24 revised estimate, as I mentioned, the third quarter was up 27.7%, bringing the revised estimate to $61.8 million. That's $11.5 million higher than the original budget estimate. So what this local use tax fund is doing is appropriating both at the higher level, the 61.8, plus the additional funds that were made available by this year's excess. So if you go down the line here, there are some of these components which are set by ordinance. The Affordable Housing Commission by ordinance gets $5 million. We've been allocating $6.5 million. They also have some separate revenue that comes in from loan payments and such. Their budget's at $6.8 million. Healthcare Trust Fund every year gets $5 million. This year that includes, as in last year, includes a behavioral health unit, which was new of the Department of Health. It also is funding a new breakout of the Health Commissioner's Office within the Department of Health, which just is under $1 million. Building Demolition Fund is $3 million per year. Once you get those off the table, then you got a $58.8 million for other departments falling within this excess use tax fund category. City Councilor's Office, it's their affirmative litigation unit of $700,000. Refuse Division, their bulky pickup program, $900,000, and their housing conservation program in the building division of $2.9 million. Now, the Office of Violence Prevention, as I mentioned, is funded fully here at $7.5 million. That includes the amount that was moved from the capital fund, as well as some of the contractual amounts that were funded with ARPA funds previously. The other big change, Police Department was increased up $4 million, offsetting that reduction in the general fund side. So they're a total of $26.6 million in the use tax. And the Health Division, one of the things that occurred during the fiscal year, if you recall, was that we carved out of the Corrections Division $2 million for a separate inmate healthcare fund to be managed by the Department of Health. That was in the general fund. That was also moved to this use tax fund, about $2 million. So in total, including that, the Health Division is at $13.7 million. Now, also utilizing some of these one-time funds for next year, we've got allocations to CDA and BPS for some special projects. CDA would include $2.2 million for modular homes in a pharmacy desert. That's a $2.2 million item. And in BPS, it's $1 million for animal shelter, as well as $1 million for Soulard Market, in addition to some of the items that we've budgeted in the capital fund, which we'll talk about in a minute. So the total budget on the use tax side is $73.6 million. And the economic development sales tax, this is another one of those sales taxes which is allocated on a percentage basis by ordinance. And you can see the percentages. The FY24 estimate is up it's only up about 0.3%. As I mentioned, the sales tax has shown little growth this fiscal year. The estimate is about $24 million. FY25, we've got a $24.2 million budget estimate. And then it's also incorporating, as departments don't spend all of their appropriations, we reappropriate some of those balances going forward. The biggest portion of these economic development sales tax funds is for transit. That's 60% of the revenues, and that is allocated to the transit account, which has been accumulating over the years. By the end of FY24, the end of the current fiscal year, it should be close to $82 million balance in that fund. And again, it will be adding another $14.3 million in FY25. 10% of the allocation goes to neighborhood stabilization, and that's divvied up between the Planning and Urban Design Agency as well as Community Development Agency. And they also have unspent funds from the prior year combined. It's a $4.7 million appropriation. 10% of that revenue also goes to workforce development, and that's those two agencies, both Slate and Director of Human Services, utilize those, and that total budget is $2.4 million. 10% goes to public safety infrastructure. That includes offsetting some of the costs related to the 911 telecom system, the controller's office, as well as SEMA's mass notification system at $100,000. The balance of that amount, the 2.4, is being allocated towards PSAP. As you know, that's an ongoing contribution and a capital item that we've been contributing to in order to get that project funded fully. And then 10% of that, the economic development sales tax, is allocated to the city infrastructure, to the capital fund. It included about a $600,000 balance. So you'll see when we get to the capital budget, there's a $3 million in revenue towards from the economic development sales tax. Yeah, another special fund, the half-cent public safety sales tax and use tax, known as Prop P. Again, that's another one that's governed by ordinance in terms of the percentage, how those are allocated. 66% of that goes to the police department, of the sales tax portion, which is $24.2 million estated, with another $1.8 million in balances. 66% that goes to the police department, and with balance there, $16.1 million. 28% of that goes to the fire department, with a small balance there, that's $7 million. And the circuit attorney, this includes a larger balance. They had not spent a number of some funds in the previous years. We've seen increases in their salaries in the general fund side. And a lot of this increase here, at least on the one-time balance here, is incorporating some of the offsetting some of those pay increases that were in the general fund side. So that budget for next year is $2.9 million. So total $26 million on the sales tax side of the public safety sales tax. Now on the use tax side, because of the rise in use tax, we're estimating $7.2 million, includes some unfunded, unspent balances. The after-school program and summer jobs program, both Director of Public Safety and the Police Cadet program, of $1.9 million. The circuit attorney also gets allocated a portion of the use tax piece of this, and it includes the witness support services of about $600,000. Recreation programs are 25% of the revenue, with including a balance there of 1.9. Total is appropriation of $1.9 million. Building demolition also receives a portion of those funds, 17.3%, including a balance there. It totals of $1.5 million. And then social work and mental health to the Department of Human Services is about $2.2 million. And that's $8.1 million total, including the unfunded and the unappropriated balances. The capital budget, it's funded at $81.1 million. It's an increase of $38.8 million, or 92% over the previous fiscal year. As I mentioned, the biggest increase of that is because we had $35.9 million as the one half of the prior year surplus, which has been incorporated into this budget. It also includes $7.7 million in street and bridge improvements. That's up $2.9 million due to the increase in the gas tax revenue that's allocated towards that fund. And all half-cent sales tax receipts allocated by ordinance. You can see by the pie chart below, most of these slices are you see every year. The ones that are, I should point out, are higher are the road and bridge improvements, which are $7.7 million, as well as that half-year prior year balance of $35.9. And not to make this illustration any busier, but I did include an illustration of where the $35.9 million is going. You can also see this in the capital budget. You can see a lot of significant projects that we have not previously funded in here, including some of the parks at $6.1 million, which incorporates some rec center pool improvements and HVAC improvements to rec centers, as well as Soulard Market totaling $2.4 million. some additional fire equipment of $4.6 million. Other municipal buildings, chillers and 1520 Market, City Hall restaurants, $5.1 million. Circuit attorney, $400,000 from some of their conference room modernizations, as well as courtroom modernization at the courts of $1.3 million, and some other city vehicles and fleet replacement of $5.7. Overall personnel changes in this budget, the general fund's down by 80 net positions, most of which you're going to see in the Department of Corrections. It's about 70 of those. You're going to see some scattered increases and decreases across other departments, but mostly you're going to see the biggest item of change in the personnel changes were in the corrections budget. In the special funds category, that's up 637 positions. That's up 52. Most of that is due to the move of the Office of Violence Prevention, which was 19 positions moved from the general fund to the use tax fund. Inmate health also was moved over, so that's 11 position increase there. In the grant fund categories, you're going to see a decline. That's 186. That's a decline of 38. Most of that is related to well, there's two things. Police department grants were down by 24, and that emergency those housing grants in the Department of Human Services, that was down by 14. And the enterprise funds, water and airport, water is up by 5 positions. Airport is up by 1. And just historical, this is just a slide I include each year for a historical perspective on changes, increases and decreases in positions. Overall, the general fund is down over the last 10 years by 153 positions, but in total, all funds, it's a decline of about 100 positions. Pensions. Pensions are one of those things in addition to debt is the kind of thing where you have to take a long-term view and you view what the trends are. And as you can see by the graph, they've been slowly creeping up over the last few years. You can see that this year it's up, it's going to rise another $1.8 million. We had already incorporated the increase that we saw from last year's significant pay package. Those were incorporated in the current year's budget. So you're going to see that increase that you saw last year has already been sort of accounted for in FY25. But the bulk of this year's increase is in ERS, which is up by $1.5 million. Its rate, as a percentage of payroll, it's up to 17.51%. But you can see that all 3 systems over time, the cost has been rising. So that's something that you always want to keep an eye on, particularly as that it's not always in 1 year, but if you look at it over the long term, we see that creeping up. And what that does is it crowds out the ability to address other things within the budget. And in terms of funded status, as another illustration, you can see that the funded status has dipped below 80%. In the last few years, we were above 80, but now we've dipped below 80% in most of the systems. You can see employee retirement system, the funded status is 73.5 on actuarial basis. The market basis is even lower at 68.2%. That means there's been some losses there that have not yet been recognized in that report. Now on FRS and FRP, FRS is the frozen plan, so that's been pretty stable at over 90% funded on an actuarial standpoint, although it's 86% funded on a market. We have been close to 80% on the FRP, although it's a little lower in the market, which means we still have some losses to recognize over the next few years. The same thing with police. It's 77.7% on an actuarial basis, 74% on a market basis. So there are some, what this suggests is that there are still some more losses to be recognized going forward. So the contributions would be going higher in subsequent years in order to make those up. Total liabilities is $633.3 million. Given all the revenue and economic uncertainties for this particular budget, we talk of potential recession or whether there's going to be recession or not. The focus on maintaining our reserves has always been a key point for us, and we've had some success in restoring reserves to a level which is considered healthy compared to where we were about 10 years ago. General fund reserve on the beginning of the fiscal year stood at $127.4 million. That's 22.5% of the FY23 budget. And as GFOA, which is the Government Finance Officers Association, recommends a minimum balance at least 2 months of operating expenditures, which is 16.6%. So we do expect knock on wood, you could have a positive result that would contribute to this going forward at the end of this current fiscal year. We hope to maintain that level for any unseen negative impact on the budget going forward. So as a recap, the total budget, all funds of $1.33 billion. That's a 0.4% increase in the prior fiscal year. General funds, $580.9 million. That's a 2.5% increase. And again, while revenue is exceeding estimates in the current fiscal year, the FY25 outlook takes a cautious approach, incorporating about a $26 million contingency reduction in both the earnings and payroll tax estimates. Budget highlights includes some increases, a $4.1 million increase in health insurance and pension costs for city employees. Meanwhile, pay increases have been held at the 1.5% merit and regular matrix deck for uniform employees. $4.9 million increase in Office of Violence Prevention, utilizing tax funds to replace expiring grants. $3.6 million decrease in the Corrections Division, including a reduction of 70 vacant positions. $2.7 million increase in Streets and Refuse, and a $2.2 million increase in Forestry and Parks for their operations. $1.9 million increase in the juvenile detention, including 14 added positions to meet their increased referrals of juveniles. $1.8 million increase in the comptroller's budget for accounting and auditing positions, and a $1.7 million increase that includes all funds for the Office of the Circuit Attorney to address their filling of staff positions. And finally, a $900,000 increase in the Board of Elections for scheduled election year. The capital budget at $81.1 million is an increase of $38.8 million, which includes the half of the prior year operating surplus of $35.9 million, and continued increase in the gas tax revenue for road and bridge improvements. And so the budget is balanced, though obviously constrained by the revenue uncertainty and other special revenue not budgeting, such as ARPA interest revenues could remain as an additional contingency. And that's the conclusion of the presentation. If you had any questions or you want to discuss any further, I'd be happy to address any of those.
Thank you, Paul. Any questions for Paul Payne on the fiscal year 2025 annual operating plan?
Oh, Paul, I have a comment. I just want to say thank you and your staff for doing such a great job this year of putting together a balanced budget. So thank you so much.
Sure, appreciate it.
I echo that sentiment, Paul. This is a labor of love, and you do a great job every year. And I would say, especially this year, is a little stressful. We got a little anxiety because we don't know what's going to happen with the earnings tax, either the current litigation or the what the State House is going to do. So we appreciate you building in that contingency there. And also, we still have yet to see what's going to happen to our budget based on the veto override. So we are trying to budget for all three of those contingencies. So thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Just one, not really a question, but asking if you could explain something for the public that you explained to me yesterday when we met on this. So we do not have the raises this year that we have done the last few years. However, if the court does rule in our favor and we do not end up with some of these constraints that we have budgeted for at this point in time, there is still a possibility in the future, even within this budget year, to be looking at salary increases. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think there is some time depending on how the fiscal year goes, and this would be something you'd probably know later when you got actual information, where you could revisit that in terms of what the revenue is, how it's tracking, and whether or not that allows for any sort of movement on a payment. Yes.
Okay.
But Paul, it's not just based on if nothing happens with the earnings tax, it's also based on our entire revenue picture, based on sales tax collections, property tax collections, And those, as you have already noted, have been pretty flat.
Yeah, again, as you know, when we do our quarterly updates, typically we get a good feel for that after that. But yes, you're right, Mayor. That would include not only analysis of the earnings tax, but how all the other revenues are performing through the quarter. Obviously, last year when we were here, everyone was suggesting that there might be a recession or reduction. Now this year, they're sort of pulling back from that, although you never know when that shoe will fall and whether it's going to hit. And it could be some world event that no one is even predicting now. So yeah, you keep on your toes, looking forward to see how revenues are doing before pulling that trigger.
But also, employees are getting the 1.5% merit increase. They're just not getting the additional 3% that they've gotten in the last 3 years.
That's correct.
Okay.
Yes, and so the point that I'm trying to make there is, well, I know that this budget is probably disappointing to some city employees because of we have been doing the work the last few years to try to play some catch up in terms of where wages need to be. If we end up I guess we need to recognize that this is a very conservative budget, and which is good. We should be budgeting conservatively and recognize that if not all of the worst case scenario happens, that there is perhaps future opportunity. And then the other question that I wanted to ask of you is looking at our reserves. Our reserves are pretty they're above those general accepted principles at this point in time. And if we continue to have these years where we have massive budget surpluses because we're not filling all of these unfilled positions, is there a conversation that needs to be had about whether it makes sense to revisit the ordinance that requires those surpluses to half go into reserves and half go into capital? Do we reach a point where it doesn't make sense to continue to put more into reserves when we could potentially use those funds to do more investments in capital or some other thing?
Oh, I think, yeah, I think you have to keep an eye on what the recurring portion of revenues are and what the non-recurring portion of revenues are. The reason why we have that policy, and it's actually a very good policy, because when you finish a fiscal year, you've got this one-time balance. It's non-recurring. So what non-recurring uses you have? Well, reserves has always been a good one. We've always been knocked for that, of having low reserves, and by the rating agencies. And then capital is also. I think there's a possibility you could look at allocating more to capital, but I'll caution a little bit in that, first of all, the reserve level they refer to is the minimum. So that's what they say, minimum. And also, and I could share with you some information later about this, but if you compare ourselves to some comparable cities, we really weren't up there in terms of the reserve level, even where we're at today. So, I mean, you try to get a feel for what the best practices are, where you fit in with comparable cities on that line. But sure, if you get to the point where you can say, okay, we're comfortable with this, and there's some one-time need, you could appropriate for capital. But I would be cautious about that, just so that we don't leave ourselves exposed to any potential downturn.
Agreed. I'm just looking at it in terms of, if we continue having these types of surpluses due to funding employees in the budget that for positions that end up not being filled. I think we still have $500 million in capital needs or about. So just trying to figure out when it makes sense to start looking at placing more into capital.
Yeah, I think what you've seen in the last few years, particularly, and this is the way it works, is you're looking in the rear mirror because you know what the number is, as opposed to projecting forward, and that's actually a safer way of doing it, because then you know, for instance, that $36.9 million, you knew that what that number was, and you weren't guessing. And so when you get that one-time number, you know that's money that's in the bank, and you can appropriate the capital. You don't have to fear that somehow that's going to disappear or not show up. So I think it's worth noting that you just got to keep an eye on make an eye on surpluses and budget estimates, and make sure that you're not cutting yourself short in terms of any sort of contingency. But yeah, I think we've been able to address some capital needs that we haven't been over the last few years. This is sort of a unique experience for me in particular, because just within the last few years, we've seen this. There were many years when we didn't see capital at all. And I know Alderman could tell you that we were sometimes reallocating in capital. And so this doesn't happen all the time. And I fully anticipate the next time we get some sort of recession, and a recession will come, and you don't know what year it's going to be, where you're going to be in that situation where you don't have the revenue. So it has been fortunate that we've had that. But yeah, we got to keep an eye and make sure that we're prepared either way.
And then I do have one last question as well. Obviously you did a lot of kind of worst case scenario planning in this budget with regard to, what happens if the court case doesn't rule in our favor, what happens if we're in a recession, and this is a pretty conservative budget. Can you speak to, there's obviously some I think difference of opinion between the Board of Aldermen and some other folks in city government over the firefighter pension bill. Can you speak to why nothing was done in this budget to address some of, I guess, those concerns that were put out? I mean, my office believes that bill saves $500,000. We have heard reports from other offices that are saying it would cost as much as 15 million. Can you speak to why that is not reflected in the budget?
I have probably written and spoken on pension issues more than about anybody here. And I can just tell you that the risk you have with pensions is that it's a long-term proposition, as I mentioned in the presentation. You take your eye off the ball, and then sometime down the road, you're going to find out, how did we get into this trouble? And you can see the costs, they're already sort of inching up now. But it's one of those things where it's death by 1,000 cuts. You do this one little thing, and then everyone says, oh, it's okay. And then the next year you do another little thing. And then over time, and again, the risk with pensions is such that it's similar to debt, but it's different from debt. Debt, when you go borrow a loan on a house, you know what your principal loan is. With pensions, it's all an actuary making estimates. And almost always it's underestimating the liabilities and overestimating the revenues. And so over time, that increases your liabilities. And you're going to see that, and you can see that with our system in terms of our 4 systems. And I firmly believe that the reform package that was passed for FRP was a good thing, and it reduced costs to the city. I mean, we're $10 million lower now than we were back then. That's something that you've got it. And as a matter of fact, I think with ERS, we should be looking at that and what we can do to get costs under control. Because what that ends up doing over time, and you're going to see this, is we talked about how we get more pay for employees, how we get that, adjust those things. If it's crowded out by pension costs, you're not able to address those. You're not able to address pay. So it's you have to look at it from a total compensation look. And I firmly believe that with pensions, it's a long-term proposition, and you've just got to keep your eye on the ball.
Yeah, and we completely agree with that. And I just want to make clear that in order to revert back to the old pension system, that there would have to be further legislation that was done through the Board of Aldermen, that just the act of having one board over both pension systems did not in and of itself revert it back to the old system. So I just want to be clear about that, because I think that there is some misunderstanding about that point. But overall, I want to thank you for the time that you've taken with my office to go through this and the public, and we can hope for the best, right? Even though we have a conservative budget, we can hope that some of these things on the horizon, whether it be a recession or the earnings tax litigation, ends up either going in our favor or not occurring, and that we end up continuing to have some of the surpluses that that we've had in the last few years, and continue to be able to make some long overdue investments in capital as a result. So I just want to thank you for all of your time, not just on this, but also in the Capital Committee and working with the Citizens Advisory Capital Committee, because all of that I know is a lot of work and a labor of love, and it's really appreciated by everybody involved. So thank you.
Paul, I have a quick question.
Sure.
Going back to the point we were making on reserves. Excuse me. Is it or is it not true that a healthy reserve position also gives you a better interest rate when you're going to the bond market? And that there are, as we look forward, there may be some bond issuances, particularly the airport, those and the Metrolink projects that are coming down the pipeline. Having a healthy reserve does give you a better rating.
Oh, yeah, yes, absolutely. One of the, again, as I mentioned earlier, one of the knocks we've had over the last, prior to the last few years, was how low our reserves were. And we took knocks from all three credit rating agencies on that, but we did get upgrades in the last couple of years simply because we have turned that around. And I think that's important to show that, yes, it basically shows that you're a little bit more resilient than living from hand to mouth each year, that you've got the ability to withstand some negative developments, whether it's something like an earnings tax hit right away, or it's some recessionary hit. I go back, I've been through 4 recessions, but 08, 09 in particular, I can tell you particularly, we saw a decline of over $14 million within 2 fiscal years. And our unreserved general fund balance was down to $6 million. I mean, that's how low that was on a cash basis. And that gets to the point where you cannot revisit that area. I mean, that's the kind of thing where it gets where rating agencies take note, and they again, your cost of borrowing goes up, and your ratings go down. So
Right.
You don't want to return to that era at all.
Right, because I've experienced with that with the reserves that the treasurer's office had, that was particularly favorable for our ratings increase when I was treasurer. So just wanted to make that additional point. Thank you. Madam Comptroller, any other questions? You're on mute.
I have no questions, but I did want to reiterate that I am very pleased with this budget. There was a lot going into it, a lot of work. And I also want to just add that this is a fiscal year budget for 1 year, but there's a lot of work that has gone into this particular budget over multiple years because of the pandemic, as well as the fallout from the pandemic. So there was a lot. One of them in particular had to do with the reserve that was not appropriated mid-year, but it was half of it was appropriated rollover into FY25, so that for the first time, we have a double capital budget. Over the years, if you look, your capital budget normally ran roughly $40 million. This year, for the first time, you have an $81 million capital budget. So that is progress in terms of the total that we're actually able to spend on capital. And I think that was one of the concerns that Madam President spoke on. We do see progress in what we're able to use out of reserves right now to pay for those capital needs that we continue to have. Capital needs are ongoing. They're never going to go away. We will always want to upgrade, repair, and continue to deliver city services to our city so that our citizens are seeing some of the repairs. We got tons of road repairs and tons of other repairs, even in City Hall, for example, continuation of repairing the roof. So, we're seeing some of the progress of what reserves actually can pay for.
Okay. Any other questions for Paul? Is there any other business to discuss? Seeing none, I'll entertain a motion excuse me, to adjourn.
So moved.
Second,
It's been moved and properly seconded.
Oh,
All those in-
one
I'm
point.
sorry.
I'm not sure if we voted to accept the budget as presented. Did we do that?
I thought that
no,
happens on Monday.
Yeah,
I know we do a vote out on Monday, but do we want to accept it as presented today? It's just a question. I'm
I
not
thought-
sure. Do we do that, Paul?
No, I
This is
don't think we
preliminary.
typically do a vote, yeah, we've received it. No, I don't think you usually do that. Yeah.
Okay, I just wanted to check.
I did want to point out there is that public hearing that we have on.
Right.
When is the public hearing? What date?
The public hearing will be Friday, April 18th from April 19th from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. Anyone who wants to testify in favor or testify on the budget can email Ms. Davis at Shannon. What email address would you like them to send that to?
They can email me at Davis, SH, as in Harry, at STLOUIS-MO.gov.
Great. Again, that's Davis, SH, at STLOUIS-MO.gov. And if you would like to testify on the budget, please email Ms. Davis no later than noon tomorrow. Is that correct, Ms. Davis?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. All righty. We have moved and properly seconded. There's a motion on the table to adjourn. All those in favor say aye.
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 Aye. Thank you. We are adjourned. Have a
Thank
great
you.
day, everyone.
Bye.